Kia ora and welcome to The Chew. Anei aho ko Corey, maua ko Alexa Forbes. Kia ora, Alexa.
Kia ora, Corey.
Nice to have you along.
Nice to be here to The Chew.
The Chew. Sorry whānau, having technical difficulties, so I couldn't bring Taika in for the interview. So you're stuck with me.
And me.
Yes. Well, so that's the main thing. We've got a special guest that has joined us, Alexa Forbes. Now, those of you in the Queenstown region may be familiar with Alexa, local councillor with Otago Regional Council now, previous councillor with Queenstown Lakes District Council. However, this interview is not about Alexa's councillor work because that's a rabbit hole we don't want to get into right now. And it's not a lot of fun talking about, all the dramas that go on a council. So what I'd like to do is open up and I'd like to ask you, Alexa, to introduce yourself, whatever way you want to. And just tell us who you are, what else you might do, and where you come from, where you were raised.
I whana mai au, ki te ao mutu. Ko Valerie, ko Ian, oku matua.
Ka pai?
Matua. Ai.
Matua?
So as you see, my way was very, very basic. But yes, I was born in Te Awamutu, and my parents are English, so he Pākehā. And but Te Awamutu is really Maori country. Much more Maori than I even knew when I was growing up, although I was very aware of some parts of it being like that. And Te Awamutu was a fantastic place to grow up.
Right.
It was the centre of my universe for a long time. And my father was the local doctor.
Okay.
So he was a maternity doctor, and he specialised in maternity. So he delivered like 3 generations of people there. So everybody knew Dr. Forbes because he either relieved them of a baby or helped them bring up their children. And he loved kids and families, and so he was really well known. So everybody knew who Dr. Forbes was. And if they'd had a baby in Te Awamutu between about 1959 and probably 1985, chances are very high that he delivered that baby.
Wow. So if there's any whānau here that either are from Te Awamutu or lived in Te Awamutu at that time, throw us a comment.
Absolutely.
Just in case your parents or you yourself may have been delivered. Yeah.
Yep. So he was pretty cool in that way, and he was a man of nature. He just loved nature. And Te Ao Māori, he really loved. He didn't know a lot about it, but he knew he loved it.
Right.
And Rongoa Māori was something that was important to him too.
Oh wow!
And he learnt bits from people around the place that taught him what Kawakawa did, for example. And
interesting.
So he had that sort of life. And my mother was a very different person than my dad. She was English as well. Dad came from quite a aristocratic sort of family, quite a high-class Scottish family. Right. And it's when I started exploring my pepia and my whakapapa and learning a little bit of Te Reo, it was fascinating. I realised that my dad came from hellish colonising family of sugar traders with interests in Jamaica. And we always thought we had Jamaican blood. And I had very black curly hair when I was a kid, and one of my sisters is really quite dark skinned, and we always thought that there was some Jamaican blood in there. But actually, when we had our DNA done, nah. We're Scottish and Irish all the way back to Norway. Anyway, so that side of my family, my father's side, which is Scottish, and Forbes, there's so many Forbeses in Aberdeenshire where we came from. Apparently they have their own telephone book. So there's a lot of us. We're common as muck, Forbeses in Scotland. And my mother's side, though, is far more Irish, and her family came from there, and they are of a very different social stratum. So they're probably the slaves sort of people, and the people that were beaten up by the British and things like that. So I kind of feel like I've got both of those sides. in my whakapapa and my family. And my mother's family had many generations in England before they came out here. And the story of them coming out to England, from England to New Zealand, is fascinating, as is everybody's story when you start digging into them. And it seems like my grandfather might have been a little bit slightly crooked and might have owed the taxman quite a lot of money, and kind of was a good idea to get out of England when they did.
That was common. You know, that was very common back in those days. You can't fault them for that. They're trying to get what they can out of the system in particular.
Yeah.
So, just to touch on something you raised, so you had your DNA done.
Sean and I did, I think it was National Geographic, were doing a thing, and they were trying to get people to volunteer to get their DNA done.
Wow.
And I was always interested in this kind of Jamaican story, which I didn't really know anything about. Although there are Forbeses in Kingston, I know that much. And but then apparently we're everywhere. We're great colonisers. And so we went along to a thing at the Memorial Hall and contributed to that program and had our DNA done, which put us in our haplogroups. And my haplogroup was relatively rare, and I think it's 9% of the world that shares my haplogroup. I can't remember what it's called.
You're going to have to explain what a haplogroup is.
I don't think I can explain what a haplogroup is. It just came back this form. Other people will know, and it's kind of the groups of people, the different parts of their mitochondrial DNA.
Oh, wow.
You don't ask what that is, but it goes down through the female line.
Right, got it.
Yeah, got it. Don't really know. Brian Sykes knows a lot about it. He wrote a book about it that I read at some point, and we went and heard him speak at the Royal Society in Wanaka, which was fascinating because he was the one that did a whole lot of study into Maori DNA that kind of put paid to a lot of myths around that. Don't ask me too many questions around that either.
Okay. So I would imagine that what he found was maybe the direction of migration movement that they went through.
That's exactly what he was looking at.
Yeah, because there's a lot of conflict around which direction the Polynesians came from, whether there was that South American link, you know, all that kind of stuff.
And I think he says that there's not.
Right.
And he says that the South American stuff was trading that Maori did because they could actually sail anywhere they wanted.
Yeah,
and they did.
And they did.
And they went off trading. So, you know, quite easy to pick up the kuma if you just go there with a boat, pick it up and bring it home. No, not easy at all. I realise that. But, yeah.
I mean, our stories talk about the waka going away for the sole purpose of bringing kumara back. So, it's... I think it's plausible for sure.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So he studied that. Anyway, we ended up in these haplogroups, and Sean, my partner, his haplogroup was related to this place, which is in modern-day Switzerland, most of his DNA, and my haplogroup was mostly Norwegian. So it kind of, so our whānau came through there.
Wow, so you're a Valkyrie.
I think possibly, yeah. I think we're a pretty nasty bunch, so watch out.
They could fight.
Yeah.
You know, so, well, I know nothing about it other than watching Vikings on TV, and it's all cool to me.
It's about the extent of my knowledge too, frankly. But anyway, so it was interesting to kind of see all that through and to see how our whakapapa might have moved and how we came to New Zealand and to be on soil that was owned by other people, and to start actually understanding that and seeing what that means in your life.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah, so that's fascinating.
It is. Well, so bringing it back to Te Awamutu, so tell us a bit about your family. Do you have many brothers and sisters?
Yeah, I've got, I'm one of six. I'm the eldest of six. Yeah, so I got 4 sisters and 1 brother.
Wow.
And it's twins at the end, and we were all born within 8 years. So Mum had 6 kids under 8,
Whoa.
which pretty much did a head in.
Yeah.
You can imagine. And she kind of lived a wee way from town, so she was pretty alone trying to bring up all these kids.
Wow.
There's also 8 dogs and 14 cats at one point, but that slimmed down over the years. And there were goats and all sorts of things.
14 cats?
I know, it was ridiculous, wasn't it?
They're all strays or something.
She used to take stuff in. Yeah. And then we had a big place about 5 k's out of Te Awamutu.
Yep.
Towards Cambridge. Kind of out in, was sort of one of the early lifestyle blocks, I suppose.
But still rural, right?
Yeah, rural, very rural.
Back in those days, everything was probably...
Everything was a bit rural around there, and it's not rural there anymore. And the town has really grown out to that area. But so we were brought up there, and there were 3 or 4 other households.
Yeah.
And we were all close. They all had kids the same age. It was like a nappy valley, I suppose.
Yeah.
At that point in time, it's where people could go and live the dream.
I mean, that's just to bring us back to Ngāti Porou again. I always do this, by the way, Alexa. I understand that dynamic where I come from in Te Puia Springs in Waipiro Bay. Everybody was everyone's family, even though you weren't technically family. So, you know, the Pākehā people down the road were still your uncles, and the kids were still your cousins. So, I get that dynamic. That was a great time to live in.
Yeah.
You know, back then when we kind of lived in shared communities.
And ours was like that.
Yeah.
And so I grew up in the 60s and 70s there.
Yeah.
And we ran pretty wild. We just did whatever we wanted.
Nice.
And we weren't allowed in the house until dinner time, you know. kicked out to go to school, and then you don't come back in until dinner.
Yeah.
So it was kind of fun. And there were bulls and horses and things to be avoided, like bulls and horses. Things to be climbed on the back of them. I was never much of a horse rider, but one of my sisters, she used to horse whisper and get onto anything bareback, broken or not.
Yeah. So your early childhood was in Te Awamutu as well?
Yeah, in Te Awamutu.
Yep.
Yeah, all my childhood. I was there till I was 17, and then
17?
Yeah.
Wow.
And then I got a scholarship, an American Field Service scholarship to go to the States for a year.
Okay.
In my 7th form year. So.
Doing what in particular?
I just went to high school exchange, a
right.
high school exchange to the States. So I went and lived in Burlington, Vermont for a year, and went to Burlington High School, which was a bit of a culture shock when I hadn't been anywhere. I don't even think I'd been to Wellington.
Right.
We used to go up every year to the Bay of Islands for our holidays, because there was a whānau up there, the Baker whānau, and a big shout out to them because they were fabulous. And Joyce Baker was Maori, and her husband Brian Baker was the fisheries inspector, and they had this property out on Urapukapuka Island, and so we used to go out there because Joyce wouldn't go there because it was tapu. So we used to go and stay there, and the tapu applied directly to some members of her family, I believe, and I'm really sorry, whānau, if I've got anything wrong in that story. But so we used to go up there and spend a long time, maybe the whole summer holidays. Dad would go back and do some work and stuff, but Mum and us kids would be out there for 6 weeks. Amazing. So we learnt to fish, sail, boat, and we just stayed on that island, and we just boated around it and swam around it and dived and fished and looked after ourselves out there. Yeah. It's amazing. Wow. So we had a fantastic childhood. I kind of think that Dad found it quite good to have 5 daughters all on an island somewhere. We keep them out of trouble.
Nice.
Yeah.
So you were the oldest.
Yeah.
Yeah. So were you kind of like another surrogate mother for
Absolutely.
the younger kids?
Yeah.
Yeah, right. So
yeah.
you kept an eye on them all and made sure that they weren't up to no good, and, you know.
I was expected to. I had a lot of responsibility.
Yeah, right.
And to feed them and keep everybody in line.
Yeah, right, right. And so when you finished school and you finished the exchange, so how long were you in?
I was in the States for a year.
Okay.
And I came home, and a friend of mine was going down to Gisborne. So
Gisborne.
Yeah.
Yes. Now we're talking.
Yeah.
This is a subject I can
be a part of. So I ended up going down there, and shock horror, I worked in Rousing. In shearing sheds, and did some horseback mustering in the hills behind Gizzy.
I did not know.
No, there's a few things, and then went to that. After that, I went skiing because I learnt to ski in the States. Hadn't really spent any time on snow before that, but learnt to ski there and was just into it. Yep. And I'd had a job cleaning barnacles off a boat, somebody's boat, in the Bay of Islands, fella called Don Shearer. And he said, if you ever want a job at the ski field, give me a call. And he managed Top of the Bruce in those days at Ruapehu. And so I rang him up after the shearing season was kind of over, and must have been about April, I guess. Done the second shear in some places. And so I went over to Ruapehu and worked at the top of the Bruce, selling tickets and then cooking. I learnt to cook. And that place. And then I worked for RAL as one of the very few female lifties. And there's a guy called Lorenz Risa who chased me up a tower one day to make sure I could knock the ice off it.
Well,
that I wasn't.
His name was Lorenz.
Lorenz Risa, yeah. He was the manager.
Lorenz.
Kia ora, Lorenz. Not with us anymore, I don't think.
Okay.
But yeah, people will know that name.
Yeah, right.
In the ski industry.
So you got the skiing bug over in the US, did you?
Yeah.
In 1 year?
In 1 year, yeah. I learned to ski quite quickly. I was a bit of a daredevil, so in those days, not now, but then. Oh, maybe. Ran for council, must be.
Yeah.
Anyway, so then what did we do? Oh, yeah, so had the time at the first season at Ruapehu, and that was awesome. Then I thought I'd better be sensible and go to university, because that's what I was always supposed to do. So I made some money shearing again that summer, but around Ohakuni. And through that whole beautiful valley, all the way down the valley that runs down to Whanganui.
Oh, yeah.
Pipariki Valley. Absolutely beautiful. So I spent a lot of time in that area and in the hills there, which are just divine, out the back of Taihape.
Yeah.
And all Ohakuni, those areas. And that was really, really cool. Yeah. Banjo Patterson's shearing gang. He was funny. Craig was his name, but we used to call him Banjo.
Banjo Patterson. That's the Australian.
That's the Australian poet.
Poet.
Yeah,
right.
yeah. And his name was Craig Patterson, but we all called him Banjo. Yeah. So he had a couple of shearing gangs, and I was in one of those.
Wow. So back in those days, was your university education free?
It was not only free, because I'd been on the scholarship. I got paid. I got what they called a bursary, an A bursary, which paid me like $39 a week. And to put that in context, I think my rent in a house in Ponsonby was about $11 a week.
Wow!
So it was enough for me to live on. Just
crazy.
I know. So
and you know, like, no offense,
no,
and you're not one anyway, but. You know, boomers complain about the young people not working hard enough.
I don't. I've never, ever complained about that, and you'll never hear me complain about that. You will hear me complain about the fact that people pay for education now. I'm a tertiary educator as well now, and I can't stand that students have to pay for that, and they still have to earn the money. Yeah. To pay for the pensions of the people like me who, I'm not a pensioner yet, but to pay those pensions of people who had free education, table mortgages of 4%, and house prices that were affordable. Oh no, I have very, very strong views on that.
Okay, so this is heading in a political
Yes, we'll move away. Move away.
So we're going to bring it back to Alexa, the person, and growing up. So where were you at university?
I was at Auckland, lived in Ponsonby and Freeman's Bay, which was just hilarious in those days. It was the days of the dawn raids and things like that, which I was pretty aware of. And I was
aware of them at the time?
Oh, very much so. But they were about in the mid-70s, and this was 81 by the time I was at university, 1980. But I was really, really aware of the Maori land marches and land rights. My father was really into it. And one of his mates, wonderful psychologist by the name of John Saxby, big shout out to his whānau, fabulous people. And they took their kids and his missus, and they all went up Bastion Point and sat there with Ngāti Whātua. So there was a lot of Pākehā in those days who understood. Yeah. And they didn't know much. We didn't know much, but we understood. And my dad, he had a similar kind of position around Raglan Golf Course and the Keriopa family, who of course Eva Rickard was a Keriopa. And he knew Eva quite well, and he went and did sit-ins and things on Raglan Golf Course. So I would have been about 14 at that time, and very, very aware of those issues. 14? And 74.
But what? And you were at university?
No, that was later. Sorry, I'm not very linear in my discussions, Coy. So I prefer a more circular approach. So 81's when I was at university, but I became very aware of those the Maori issues and the land rights and those things in the early 70s, because that's when my parents were. They were quite They were a bit hippie-ish, my parents, and they sort of, but
Nice
they
one.
kind of felt those things quite strongly, and so we were very aware of it. I know a lot of New Zealand wasn't. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
But I was at university at the time of the Springbok tour. In those days, no, I wasn't somebody that marched against the tour. I just couldn't stand sports, so I didn't care what anyone did with sports. I was, by that time, starting to really get into music.
Right.
But I was also studying political science at the uni, and Helen Clark was one of my lecturers,
right?
And she was very strong on this. So she had gathered a whole pile of students to go off and protest, and they were getting arrested and things
against
the Springbok tour.
The Springbok tour.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh,
and
Auntie Helen, eh?
Auntie Helen, yeah.
Look at her. She was socially aware back then.
Oh, yeah, she was. And anyway, so that was all quite interesting. I was more interested, and I really wasn't interested in that.
Yeah.
Kind of watched it and thought, oh, yeah.
Yeah. So
Can't take anything.
I'm going to pull us out of the
politics again. Gosh, I've taken us down there again. I'm so sorry.
It's fine.
Yeah.
Like this is organically you. So if you can't help yourself moving in these directions, that's just what we're
I'll try and be a bit more disciplined.
No, you don't have to. But I heard you mention something. So you had interest in singing.
Yeah.
You mentioned at one point. And so how did that all come about?
My mother was a singer, and she was a pretty good singer. She used to. Actually, somebody reminded me the other day, they sent a program through on Facebook. It was from the All in Some Folk Club. And actually, that was Halcyon Saxby. Shout out to you again, Saxby family. And funny enough, those people I grew up with, they're still my closest friends, because we really did grow up together. They're like brothers and sisters, because we're first generation. And when you're first generation, you ain't got any cousins or anything else. So the friends that you have as a child become really important.
Of course.
And so she sent me this thing, the All in Some Folk Club, because her mother, Felicity Saxby, and my mother, Valerie Forbes, used to sing together. And they were great singers, all folk music and stuff, Yeah. Oh, the weary cutters and oh, the weary seas. So it was all these Irish sea shanties and stuff like that they used to sing.
Okay.
Everybody just show up, and by 10 o'clock the kids would be whinging there'd no food, and someone would go and get fish and chips and feed us all, and they'd just sing all night. I think there might have been a few drugs floating around at those times. And that was in the 70s again. And so we had a lot of music in my family. And then we were all brought up with it. And my sister Melanie, shout out to her, is an incredible musician, always was. Play anything, saxophones, violins, pianos. She did a performance letters in piano, so she's really quite a qualified musician as well. Flutes, guitars, anything you threw at her, she'd play. And beautiful singer and songwriter. Anyway, so after our second... another ski season. So throughout my university years, and I didn't finish, I only did 2 years, but they were. Then I got offered a job that I didn't want to turn down at Ruapehu, managing. Exactly, I wasn't going to turn that down. Managing a new cafe that they'd built, and I'd kind of learned to cook, because when I was at university, I'd gone to Pakatoa Island, and as a second chef, so I was learning to cook out there and. Doing that, and I really loved it and enjoyed that, and so I had a great summer out there. And then the next year, the guys that were opening at this new restaurant, they said, "Come down and run it." And I wasn't going to go back to university that third year to do that, so I wandered off down there. And there was no snow, or there was snow, it just wasn't a terribly good season. And I had a really hard job to do, and it nearly killed me. So at the end of that season, must have been...
What was so hard about it?
Oh, I was just really young. I was like 22,
so
and I was trying to manage staff, trying to manage food in a new kitchen that wasn't broken in, and it was really big for me. It was okay, managed it, and kind of learned a lot and enjoyed it. But then at the end of the season, and my sister was working over at Turoa, at Ohakuni, and she had a really big season too. She was really, really busy, and neither of us got much skiing, so we thought, bugger this, let's pack up and we'll go to the States and go skiing in Squaw Valley. Or go somewhere, we didn't know where. Yeah, so we did. So that November 1982... we packed our bags and got on the Big Bird.
November 1980. You even remember the month as well as the year. Look at that. November 1982. And where'd you go?
We landed in LA with $500 between us, and we spent 400 on a Ford Pinto. Don't laugh.
Nice.
And then we drove north, and we ended up in Squaw Valley, Lake Tahoe.
Oh, okay.
And we couldn't get work because we didn't have any green cards.
Right.
And we didn't have any way of making money, and we didn't have any money, so we needed to do something quite quickly. So we whipped out the guitar and started busking. Yeah.
I thought that story was going to take a different turn,
Nope.
but thankfully you whipped out a guitar.
Whipped out a guitar
Cool.
and started busking, and that just started a music career. Really, within a few days, somebody had said, "Come and play in my restaurant, and I'll feed you and give you a place to live," and that's what we did.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow, that's wicked.
And then we travelled right across the states just busking. We just pulled into a town somewhere, and the car broke down. Ford Pinto. Pretty much died, but we did manage to revive it in a place called Las Cruces, New Mexico, which is kind of like where a lot of people without visas showed up because it was in a no man's land between Mexico and the States. So we were there for about 6 months while we made enough money to make the car go again, and it was amazing. We lived in a house with these Mexican guys. It was hilarious. We had so much fun there. And you have to play frisbee to cool down. It was so hot. We spent a summer there.
Yeah.
Unbelievably hot. And so you sort of make your body work like a swamp cooler by throwing frisbee.
So you were at Lake Tahoe,
Yeah.
were you? How far north is that?
That's up Northern California.
Oh, okay. So it's still within. Northern California is still quite high up, though.
Yeah, it's pretty cold there.
Yeah.
But we came out of there in around probably end of March, something like that, the end of their ski season.
Yeah.
And we went to Yosemite National Park, spent a few weeks there climbing, saw a bear.
Yosemite.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, we went climbing with a bunch of climbers. That was kind of fun.
No, you didn't see Yogi, of course not.
We did see a bear, not Yogi.
No.
We saw a brown bear.
Wow.
No. Was it brown bear? Black bear? Can't remember, whatever the bears are that have there. Not a big grizzly or anything, but a bear. Pretty scary, and she had 3 cubs.
No.
And she chased her cubs up the tree, and we knew that was trouble.
Oh, yeah, right.
So we turned and sort of backed off really slowly, but I did get photos, which I was told,
you?
I've still got them. I was greatly told off by the conservation person, or the warden.
For taking photos?
Yeah, for staying around long enough for
there?
taking photos.
Okay.
Yeah. And anyway, that was kind of cool.
And
But I was glad I had proof. They wouldn't have believed me otherwise.
Yeah. And so you came down, and you just busked all the way down?
Busked all the way, yeah.
Wow.
Busked all the way wherever we were. And then we went to New Orleans and busked there for a while. That was fun. Listened to fantastic music there.
Yeah.
And jazz and stuff like that. And we made our way up to New York City.
Yep.
And
wow.
North Carolina, and stayed in New York City for a while. We had a very wealthy friend there that wanted to record our music. And
Donald Trump?
No, his name was Barry Bergman, rest his soul. Fabulous whānau too.
Could have Barry.
Yeah, we spent a lot of time with that whānau over the next few years.
Right.
He was a very wealthy man, and he was incredibly generous, and he loved our music. Actually, many years later, he flew Mel and I from New Zealand to North Carolina to play at his daughter's wedding, Kia ora Janice. But we've had just so many good times, and he was fantastic to us and supported us and our music. Anyway, so we went all the way back up to Burlington, visited my friends there, and then we got our year-long ticket. Used to buy these tickets for a year. That was good for a year. And so we got back on about 2 days before our ticket expired, we got back to New York Airport, JFK Airport, to fly out back to New Zealand, Pan Am. And there was a big queue of people and this huge fuss going on, a bit like a music festival, and a ticketing desk at the airport. And we're like, well, what's that all about? And it was a dude called Freddie Laker had set up a private airline, and it had these $99 tickets from New York to London. And Mel and I, $99. And these are in the days when our ticket to go to and from the States, return ticket open for a year, was $2,000.
Wow.
So you can see how the cost of air travel's come massively down in those years. Anyway, so we thought that looked a lot more fun than going back home.
Yeah, well, I'd imagine you'd be sitting next to some lady with a chicken and some other guy with a pig or something.
That kind of stuff. So anyway, we stood in that line and ended up getting tickets, $99 to London. Rang Mum and Dad, said, we're not going to be on that flight home. We're off to London. So that took us another 3 years before we got home, and we played music. You
mean an extra 3 years after that?
Yeah.
Wow. And so you just you left home on a wing and a prayer, didn't really have a plan.
No.
Okay.
We just wandered, and we wandered all around France, and we learnt to speak French pretty well. It was much easier for me to learn French than Te Reo Māori, and I don't quite get that yet. Maybe my brain's just got old, but
no, it was something. Hard for me too.
It's hard, It's just hard to learn.
Yeah.
And we lived in Chamonix, spent a couple of ski seasons in Chamonix in France, in the Haute-Savoie, the high mountains. It was fantastic. And then finally came home, and when I came home, my sister and I picked up a gig with Midge Marsden, and we spent several years singing with him. We went
several years?
Yeah. Kaitaia to the Bluff 3 or 4 times, touring with Midge.
Wow.
Yeah.
What is a backup singer?
Backing singers, yeah. Yeah.
Wow. And how many of you? So it was you and your sister.
Oh, and the band in those days, Midge was work. I mean, he was just amazing, and big kia ora, big shout out to Midge. We used to call him the finishing school of rock and roll because he was just such an inspiration and so generous and kind with his time and everything that he did. And he really looked after anyone that came into his orbit. He was beautiful, beautiful man to work with.
Yeah.
And he taught us so much. And I shouldn't have been there. I wasn't that much of a musician, but my sister Mel was just stunning. And somehow the two of us singing together with our harmonies kind of appealed. And so
I get that. Just one thing, whānau. So Alexa is in our Waiata group, in our Māori Waiata group here in Queenstown, and she's one of the linchpin people within our group in terms of how we sing, in terms of supporting us with harmonies in particular. And just giving us direction, because we're not musicians by any stretch, and Alexa's quite. We hold Alexa up in quite high regard, not as a counsellor, as a singer.
Kia ora, Corey. Thank you for that. I'm really, anyway, won't go into my abilities or lack of it, but anyway, so we toured with Midge, and it was just amazing. But you asked how many people were in the band. Well, it ranged. It depended on. Midge, if there was enough money in it, he'd have the full 13, which we used to call the Dirty Dozen.
The
Dirty Dozen, yeah. And that dozen would feature what we used to call the Phantom Horns. The Phantom Horns were guys from the army.
Oh, yeah.
That would just come on in within the horn section, and suddenly, da-da-da, you'd look, holy moly, there they are, there's the boys. And they'd come. So
were they the brass band?
Yeah.
From the army?
Yeah. There were 3 or 4 of them, 3 or 4 of the players would turn up. And so the music would be really nicely scored for them, and they'd come in and play something. But so you could have the Dirty Dozen, or you could go down to just, quite often when he came to Queenstown, there'd just be, because my sister and I moved to Queenstown. We moved in with Nigel Hurst, big shout out to Nigel too.
Kia ora, Nigel.
He played a lot of sax, and he used to play with Midge's, a lot of Midge's bands.
Did he? Like what, just in the southern region?
No, he used to play in the Mudsharks back in Raglan.
Wow.
So there's a lot of connections.
Yeah.
And so Midge was fabulous. So when he came down here, often just whoever was here, we'd get in behind him. This guy called bass, who played bass in Dunedin, still does fabulous, Johnny Dodd. Kia ora, Johnny.
Kia ora, Johnny.
And he would pull together a drummer. Sometimes Ned Webster is just awesome on anything he did. Kia ora matua, Ned. And Ned and Nigel, of course, they were just fabulous together, and we'd often sing with them and play with them. And I still remember the night that Margaret O'Hanlon wandered into town with her New York accent and her beautiful...
Kia ora, Margaret.
Kia ora, Margaret, her fame-trained voice, and Nigel just falling over. And Mel and I lived with Nigel. We flattered with Nigel and the late Kevin Thomas, who was, of course, just a magnificent drummer and who drummed with all of Midge's bands. And he tragically died quite a number of years back now. And so there was all of those things sort of tied in. And Nigel, Mel and I lived in a house in Dublin Street. And near
in Queenstown.
In Queenstown.
So how did you end up in Queenstown? Was that like a natural progression from the band to here?
It was we'd spent a summer touring with Midge, and it was a fantastic. The first tour we ever did with Midge was amazing. And Midge did things by tours. He didn't work all the time.
Yeah,
he just worked in these tours, and then he worked on his albums and stuff in between. So after a summer tour, we'd picked up a manager. for Mango, the band that Mel and I were in, and Nigel often played sax with us. And Nigel had already been living in Queenstown, and he sort of said, "Oh, you want to make your way down here?" And this manager booked us a tour all the way to Queenstown, and a residency for the winter in Queenstown at the Hyatt. In those days, Pepper's Restaurant at the Hyatt, which is now one of those places, Adelaide Street. Changed something, whatever it was. And so we made our way down here. And that was in the winter of 1986, after we got back from France. And we spent the summer after we got back from France, right before Christmas that year, and went immediately into a tour with Midge. Met him, my mum, actually, took us to a party, and we ended up, Kevin Thomas was playing, and Midge was there, and it was friends of my mum's, the Firths. And we got up and sang a song. For no good reason, just did. And then Midge came over and said, "Oh, do you girls want to come and work with us?" And we said, "Yeah, that's a good idea." So we did that tour with Midge, and then wandered on. And then that next winter, Selwyn had booked us a tour all the way down here. So we had places to play all the way down. And then we got to Queenstown, supposed to do our residency here for 6 weeks, and then wander back up the North Island. And we just cancelled the other wandering back up and stayed here.
Wow.
And kind of been here. Oh, we went back and did many tours with Midge after that, 87, 88, 89. We toured with Midge, but always based from Queenstown.
Right. So, were you with them? The only song that I really remember, I think it was Burning Rain.
Burning Rain.
Yeah.
Burning Rain was written by a really good friend of mine and a friend of my mum's. He used to play guitar with my mum when she used to sing. His name was Michael Farrell. God rest his soul. He was the most beautiful man and fantastic musician. He really was New Zealand's answer to Eric Clapton. Just brilliant musician. And he wrote Burning Rain. And yes, we were with him then. I wasn't singing on that album. My sister was singing and playing on it. Again, I wasn't that good. I just hung in. I was good for the tours and things. But when it came to the recording, they would put other people in, which was fine. I wasn't worried about that at all. So, so Mel was.
I don't necessarily believe that, but that's fine.
That's so. Melanie was on that Burning Rain album, I believe, and I'm not sure if Nigel was. Can't remember. But anyway, yes, we toured that. We did that Burning Rain tour with Midge. Fabulous. Wow. And Michael Farrell did that too, and he hardly ever toured. He had some health issues that he didn't like to tour, but he did do that one. Oh, I remember playing Gisborne that tour. That was hilarious. There was a nightclub.
What year?
88, 89. With a really high stage.
Was it like a 2-story place?
Yeah.
What's it called? Crossroads?
Something like that. I can't remember.
Yeah, it could have been Crossroads of Night Owl. No, there was another upstairs one too. I can't remember the name of it. Yeah. Anyway,
there was some pretty... And Sid Limbert was the bass player with us, and he was magnificent. Kia ora, Sid. And Sid's son has now picked up that mantle. That's Fred. And, so all those relationships still stay there, and the Mudsharks keep playing, and they kind of...
I have
that Raglan music scene's huge.
The Mudsharks. So that was Nigel's band, was it?
It was Midge's. It was really a collection of people in Raglan, and I'm bound to get it wrong if I try and get the whakapapa of that right, so I won't even really try. But there were people like Dave Maybe, wonderful guitar player. All sorts of people have come and gone through there, and wonderful musicians. And they used to play at the Raglan pub.
Wow.
Pretty much. I can't remember even the regularity, but we used to go along quite a lot and sing if we could. But there's some real stalwarts of that, and Sid Limbert's one of them.
So when you finally made the decision to move here, did you know what you wanted, why you wanted to be here? Was it just this is a kind of a cool place to live, or was there a bigger aim in mind?
No, and as you see from my life to that point, I was a wanderer. Right. I didn't think too much into the future. I just enjoyed being wherever I was. But I also, te taio, is that it? Nature was always really important to me, the natural world.
Yeah, te taio. Good place for te taio.
Exactly. And I really missed the sea when I was here.
Yeah.
But I really loved being here, and I loved the mountains, and winter here was just magnificent. So I don't really know, but we just were here, and just stayed here because I really loved the environment.
Nice. And so I know bits about your background where you ended up at working at the radio station.
Oh yeah, that's right. Because I didn't really we played music here for several years, and then my sister Melanie, she got a gig with the guys from the Narcs. They'd set up a new band in Australia, so she headed off there with them. And I was here, and I decided to stay here. I was really happy to stay here and happy for her to go and actually explore her musical career, which she needed to do. And so I played in a couple of bands here for maybe a year. Then I gave up smoking. And that just meant I just couldn't go into a bar. I just hated the smoke.
Ah, right.
So in those days you could still smoke in bars.
That was a random thing to say. I was thinking, how does that tie into the story?
But these are the sorts of things that when you kind of live in the present and not too worried about where things are going, you sort of bounce. Things bounce you out of something.
Totally
smoking, giving up smoking bounced me out of the music industry.
Wow.
It really did.
Wow.
And so I wasn't really that sure what to do, but I've always wanted to be a journalist, and I thought that my university training would get me into that career at some point.
Yeah.
Because I did love analysis and looking at politics and things like that. So, I couldn't get a job as a journalist, but the Mountain Scene had a salesperson job going, and I always realised that sales, selling advertising and tying down stories are just two sides of the same coin. Yep. So I took that job until they finally let me sell and write features, which they did for a while. And then Chaz Drader, my partner's father, Chaz Drader had started up a ski radio here, Ski FM. And in 1992, he went all out, got some investment from some local dudes, Dave Laurent, kia ora, Dave, and he now works at Mata 10. Dave's a great guy, and he's some stories there, but we won't go there. You'll know what I'm talking about. And Graham Brown. Dave Laurent.
Oh,
do you know him?
Yes, Dave. Manu and Dave.
Manu and Dave. Exactly. Manu's partner, Dave.
Yep.
And so Dave was, he put a lot of money into getting, which was a lot when somebody didn't really have a lot, probably.
Yeah.
And got this radio station going, and they employed me as their journalist. So that was really awesome. So I had this job as a journalist on the radio station, and that bounced me into kind of doing breakfast shows with Chaz and morning shows. I think I'm the only radio person in the country that started on the breakfast show and ended up on the night show. It's supposed to go the other way around, but I loved doing the night show because I used to do some really quite radical things. We had the O of Love show. The O of Love show.
The O of Love.
Orgasm. O.
It's all right, I'll catch up. Give me time.
It was really fun. And we used to run these desperate and dateless nights. And honestly, it was just chaos. You wouldn't be allowed to run radio like that now. But it was risque and hilarious. And I just really enjoyed it. And pulling together people, you'd find out someone who didn't have a girlfriend or boyfriend, and you'd get them on the line and embarrass them. And
nice.
And pull them together and give them a free meal up at Giuseppe's. Giuseppe's a pizza place up in Fern Hill in those days. Yeah. Giuseppe's, and we used to take them all up there on a Friday night. And all these desperate and dateless people, a few men, a few women. We weren't very aware of LBQ plus in those days. I also would have incorporated that too, but we didn't have a lot of that around. And so we used to do those. We had one wedding, and they came and we had a story about that. That was pretty funny. So that was kind of fun. I used to do that show with Katrina Khalil. She's a Lebanese woman that had Habibis. Kia ora, Katrina. And still one of my very dearest friends. That's who I went and spent New Year's with up in Motueka earlier this year. But those connections, just connections and people and having fun. So in the radio, I was always a bit risque on the radio, so I sort of bounced out of the normal times and into the late times so I could run these shows that talked about sex and agony aunts and fun.
Did you fix for were you like a therapist?
Oh, we did a few of those. That was pretty funny. But I had to be really careful with that actually. Yeah. Just had to not do it seriously. But you got to be really careful. But desperate and dateless, you kind of get away with quite a lot of fun. And O of Love and Katrina, of course, she's just sensual Middle Eastern woman who I used to do that with. And there was a dude who used to work with me in the news, and his name was Greg Mayer. Kia ora, Greg. Haven't seen him for years. And Greg Mayer was Indonesian Maori ethnicity.
Indonesian Maori?
Maori, yeah. And he was gay, and he was so much fun. And we had a very risque show called Eye on the Wakatipu. And we'd just talk about all the parties and events that had happened. But we did get into trouble a couple of times, got told off. But yeah. Anyway, so that was kind of my radio career.
Right.
And then
so
we bounced out of that.
So all this time, look, if I go back to what you said about your childhood and how, let's say you were socially aware.
Yeah.
You know, so you knew about stuff that was going on, political things that were going on. So did you always keep an eye on the political side of things while you were going through your music career, doing your travelling, etc.? Yep.
I lost sight of it in those years.
Yep.
I really did. Between 81 and 90, I really didn't take any notice of politics anywhere in the world.
Oh, wow. So even when you were in the US, didn't care about the political sort of system and what was going on?
No, I don't know what happened in my brain, but I just went into different things. I started really enjoying existential reading and things like that. Authors like Milan Kundera and Franz Kafka and Russian authors. I got really interested in so, theories of the oppressed and writings from the oppressed, and I really enjoyed that. And it would have fed into my political views now, but at the time I didn't think about it at all.
So I'm saying wow because I don't actually know what that all meant. I'm not a I don't know. I'm not a reader, I suppose. I'm not very much a book person, but it sounds intelligent, whatever it was.
Kind of. I got, when I was in the States the first time as a student, I had a wonderful, I had marvellous teachers. Couldn't believe how good they were. Not like what I got at Te Awamutu College, I can promise you. And there was a woman who taught an incredible course called Man's Search for Meaning. And Man's Search for Meaning is the title of a book by an existential author called Viktor Frankl. And existentialism is about our existence.
Ah, okay.
So that's
I was going to ask that question. What does that actually mean?
Yeah, existentialism is our existence. So people writing existentially are writing about our existence. And
but what, from a philosophical perspective, not from a scientific?
No, from philosophical perspectives, and often stories of really hellish scenarios behind the Iron Curtain, behind, in Auschwitz. Well, Viktor Frankl's book, I'm not sure if he was can't remember which concentration camp he was in, but he was a doctor, and what he saw was horrific, and he wrote Man's Search for Meaning. So, people searching for meaning within, whoever's some expert in existentialism is going to kill me. But, they're
it's
just...
all right, this isn't going to get out.
Thank God for that. So looking into our existence and what it really means. And so I got really tied up with those writers, especially the ones behind the Iron Curtain, and that was kind of the only politics I was really aware of was the Cold War between Russia and America.
Right.
And the writing that produced was incredible, but when I got home, I still really wasn't interested in politics. I was still looking at some of these writers, and some of the Indian ones started coming my way because my father, apart from loving everything about New Zealand, he also loved everything about India, and he travelled to India quite a lot, and he adored India, everything about India. He was a real India-phile, and he used to come back with these marvellous books, come out with them and say, go and read this and go and read that, and I used to, and they were really existential writing as well. And then he came out with a few from Africa, so he was kind of into that, and I was his daughter and used to read those books.
Wow. So, so in case you haven't noticed, Whānau, this backdrop here, it's not fake. You see all these books here? They actually get used.
I could take you for a tour of these books. That would be amazing, because Sean Drader's got a lot of books too. Because I met Sean for his father, of course.
Yep.
He came to meet his father, who he hadn't seen since he was little.
Ah.
Yeah. And his father, I think, sent him a ticket. And he walked in the door, this tall, blonde, handsome Australian. I thought, oh, not bad.
So, on another episode, there's if not today, but if Sean is keen, I'd really like to interview Sean as well. Both of you guys have lived some really interesting lives that are always worth putting on a podcast, both of you. So, shout out to Sean. I can't wait to have a chat to him about his experiences too. Yeah, and how he met, his version of how he met Alexa Forbes. So, would you like to, I don't know, give us a condensed, non-detailed version of how you and Sean met?
I'm not that great at condensed non-detail, but I'll do my best. Well, he came in to meet and to see his father, who he hadn't seen for many, many years because his parents had split up, and Sean had been brought up in his later teenage years in Australia, in Canberra. So he came back to meet his dad, and he was in the Federal Police there. And so we met, and I think I was sitting on the floor in the radio station cutting out things for some promotion or another, and he walked in. Anyway, we got on quite well, and he started ringing into my request show, because I used to have the O of Love show was, of course, a request show. All sorts of requests happen in the O of Love show. Anyway, so he started ringing in every night with requests, and that was all good. And then he went off fishing with his father, and some big bunch of roses turned up on Valentine's Day.
Nice.
I was pretty sure they were from him, but the florist wouldn't tell me. And the florist was Kerry Lee Marsden. Big shout out to Kerry Lee. Haven't seen her for years, but people might know her. And she delivered this bunch of roses, but wouldn't tell me who they're from. I was pretty sure they're from Sean. So we mark the Valentine's Day as our anniversary, because we've never married or anything like that. So,
that's
and that would have been
to ours as well. Yeah.
Oh yeah. So that would have been 94. So quite a long time ago.
Nice.
Close to 30 years now.
Nice.
And when Solomon turned up, it was kind of locked it in.
Yeah. And so I'm just going to just throw these out there. So when did he put a ring on it?
We never had a ring on it.
Yeah.
Never done it.
So is that a story? Is there a story to tell there?
Well, I don't know. Sean's 12 years younger than me, so I always thought, nah, that's too young. They're going to get sick of this pretty soon. But we just sort of haven't. And now it's can't be bothered. So his father had 4 marriages.
Yeah.
And his mother had 2. So he probably thought that enough had been done in terms of marriage. And then I never wanted to get married. I've never been married. And it seems like an odd tradition to me.
Oh, yeah.
So haven't done it.
Yep.
So that's where we are.
I get that. So good explanation. Sorry to delve into.
No, you're very welcome.
It's all right. I'm not really sorry. I'm just interested about all of it, really. The other thing, and it's distracting me, so I have to raise it. If you can see this background, whānau. So these books have been colour-coded. I'm not sure if you noticed, but they go from, is it like, well, there's dark on one end, blues, it looks like white in the middle, then it goes to orange and then random colours towards the end. It's amazing that people have the focus to like order their books like that.
That's called OCD. Yeah, definitely on the spectrum.
Wow, wicked.
Yeah, but actually, it's quite interesting. I don't really have a problem finding books in it. Although I'm not really a colour person, I actually can usually put my hand on it. So maybe there's quite a lot in ordering them that way. Because we've got a lot of books because it goes right round and can sort of find them. All our Maori books are right here. Look, big collection there now.
I saw that. You've got some of the ones I have as well. Ngā Pepeha, good one. That Tangata Whenua, I have that as well.
Yeah, that's awesome.
And of course, the great Scotty book, Māori Made Easy.
Yeah.
So next we'll move into, what's a good segue into your journey into learning te reo. You've been on this journey for a little while.
Yeah. One Waitangi day, 5 or 6 years ago, whenever we started, we were walking through the park and there was the Waitangi Day celebrations there. And Jeremy Van Riel.
Right.
Kia ora to you, Jeremy.
Kia ora tati.
And he was out there trying to rope in a few people for his SIT Level 1, Level 2 course.
Yep.
And he really was short of numbers that year. I don't know if you remember, but it took a while to build numbers in that course.
Yeah.
And he asked if we'd like to join, and we said, yep. And he said, well, come down now and sign up.
Sign up.
Which we did.
So you did you did your year one the same with Caroline, right?
Yes, I believe we did. The beautiful Caro.
Yes, you did. You did year one and year two together.
Yep.
That's right, you did.
And year 3, 4, didn't we? Yeah, year 1, 2, and 3, 4.
So that's interesting. That year that happened, because I'm sitting here going, I'm trying to remember this. Just a little bit of background, whānau. So I used to work as a kaiawhina or teacher's aide for Jeremy when Jeremy was the kaiako Māori here in the Queenstown region for Māori classes. But I've just realised now that I'm working out where we were at the time, or where I was at the time. I've just worked out that I was doing the level 3, 4 on this in the same year that you signed up for your level 1, 2.
Probably, and the kaiawhina was Anna.
Anne,
yes. Anne, Ngāti Porou Anne.
Yeah.
Man, did you remember how she used to swing those hips?
Oh, swing the hips, yeah, that's just...
And fabulous singer.
That's default kapahaka for the ladies up home.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, she's awesome voice too. Yeah,
fantastic.
Really awesome voice.
So we started there.
Yeah, right. So that was your... So, but what brought you in? Like, what was it? Was it Jeremy? Was it his manner in bringing you in? Or
no.
Was it a bunch of other things that collided at the same time?
Yeah, I've always wanted to. I would have started many years earlier had there been the opportunity.
Right.
I had seen the opportunity. I didn't know anyone was doing. I hadn't actively looked for courses, but I always wanted to. I think I've wanted to since I was a child.
Right.
Used to have a Māori teacher, Mr. Manu, at Te Amutu College, and he was fabulous. Shout out to him. No idea where he is these days. But he got us a real love for the language, even though I didn't really learn any. It was only 1 year, I think, in those days.
Oh, that's a shame.
Yeah, I know. And and I always wanted to after that. And a lot of happy times had been spent on marae and at up home, and when people were having babies, and when I don't know, I loved a lot of things about Maori people and what I saw in my own home, and that was just from an observation perspective.
Right.
And I didn't know much about it, and some years on, I was absolutely horrified to learn that I've been brought up about 200 metres from one of the biggest Maori battles ever.
Right.
And I didn't know about it.
Yeah, of course.
And that that made me feel very angry, and that must have been about 10 years ago, I suppose.
Yeah.
And I was really angry about that, and having that anger was quite made me start reading some of the books. I still, I suppose, didn't really have the drive or...
Yeah.
I didn't think I could learn the language. I didn't know who would possibly teach me how, to me it was hardly spoken anywhere. How would I learn the language?
Yeah, so that was level 1, level 2 that you did.
Yeah.
And I remember because the very next year, I believe you did the level 3 and the level 4 because you did that with my wife, Caroline, and I was the teacher's aide for that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Was it the next year? Didn't we have a year in between?
You may... No.
Oh, maybe not. No, it was next year?
You did 2 years in a row.
All right.
It's the same as Caroline.
Yeah.
So, but then you had a gap.
Yeah.
So, I remember you did year 1 in level 1 and level 2. Then you did level 3 and level 4.
Yeah.
And I think it was two years ago in 2020.
Did level 5.
We did level 5.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
So Alexa was on my course doing a level 5 Te Ara Reo Māori, which was fantastic. I don't know how well you enjoyed it.
Oh, I loved it.
Yeah.
Yeah, there were some aspects that were
they're
me.
But
I overall I absolutely loved it. And what I learned, what can you say?
So given you've come so far, and me personally knowing you at a personal level and watching your journey, as I watched a lot of our friends' journeys in Te Reo, I've seen massive change. Yeah, huge. You guys don't notice it because it's so it's so small. It's such a small increment, but I remember how you guys were at the start. So now from your perspective, just tell me some things maybe that you were surprised to know. Now that you are here where you are now, thinking back to when you started, is there anything about this journey that surprised you?
Yeah, I guess if you're surprised by what you learned, there's a heap. But I'm used to learning all the time, so I'm not really surprised when some really big shifts happen, because I love to learn. Anyone that knows me will know that I'm always in courses and doing stuff. But things that I learned that were really, really huge was trying to understand the role of Pākehā in this world that we have now.
That's a good one.
And that's a real biggie. And there's some real shifts that happened. Hard to really, and it's not hard for me to put my finger on. I just don't really know how to explain them. Things like understanding that it doesn't matter what I think. It's got nothing to do with anything. In Te Reo or Te Ao Māori, nothing that I think has any impact or import or matter on anything. And there's nothing wrong with that. I'm very happy with that. The other thing that I think was quite surprising for me is that there is no one way for Maori.
Oh yeah,
and that everything in Te Ao Māori sits within their own kaupapa of their own marae, of their own way of being taught.
Tika, pono, absolutely.
And so I've really enjoyed that, and I've really enjoyed the learning. It's hard to say, but I've really enjoyed not having to have an opinion on shit. Because it doesn't matter what that is, because it's nothing to do with me. I'm just Pākehā learning that stuff. And so they can have all their opinions all over the place, and I don't care. Somebody asked me once, it was lovely, lady who had the moko recently. Anyway, Gina. Yep. Beautiful Gina. Shout out to Gina. I love Gina.
Kia ora, Gina.
She just taught us so much. But listening to Gina, and she asked us one day what we thought about her having moko. And it was like, and that's when I became really aware that my opinion has absolutely no import at all. And I knew that. And I just said, it doesn't matter what I think. I think it's absolutely beautiful, but it doesn't matter what I think. It's of no import to anything at all. And I actually really enjoyed the freedom of that.
Yeah.
As Pākehā, actually having to have no opinion about this.
Yeah, you don't have to.
And so that was kind of a really surprising thing to learn. And I've noticed that in our Waiata group too, Waiata Tea, is that I've picked up a lot of the kind of lead singing roles, not because just because I can, kind of, and I can do that. And
you're the only one that puts their hand up.
I know. So what I'm trying to do now, and this is all come from my journey in Te Ao Māori, is to go, okay, I'll sing them until somebody else is ready to put their hand up. So now I wait, and if anybody else puts their hand up first, I'm delighted. It's something I don't have to do. And that's really cool. Whereas I think many years ago, I would have wanted to maybe push myself forward, or, I don't know, take the lead role or something. And in my journey in Te Ao Māori, I don't feel like that at all. I feel like, if I can help, I'll do something. But otherwise, I'm not actually interested. I'm more interested in somebody else having a go.
Yeah.
And I'm enjoying that aspect.
Yes. Well, you hit the nail on the head, because our culture is about what's good for the collective, not what's good for the individual. So as individuals, you have roles to play, for sure, but you've always got to bear in mind that it's what's good for the collective, right? So there's less focus on individual selfishness. So it's interesting. I like the fact that you raise that. I haven't heard it before from anyone. So that's an interesting concept, and especially coming from people that normally are very opinionated and quite often have the need to share their opinion, whether it's warranted or not. So I notice that happens with absolute beginners. Absolute beginners come into learning Te Reo, learning our language, and they'll pick and they'll poke and they'll ask, why do you do it like that? English does it like this. I don't understand. Why are we doing this? Why does it do that? And, you know, I learned very quickly to just say, well, because that's how it is. Like, I don't have to sit here and justify why our language works this way. That's just what it is. If you think back to when you're a child learning English, no child back in the day said, why am I speaking like this? I would rather speak like that. No, you just tell what you've been, you take what you've been told and you apply it. There's no questioning what your English is. So it's interesting that adults do that when they learn another language. They go, why do you do it like that? That's not what English does. You know?
Because our thinking is so shaped by the cultures that we're brought up in.
Yeah.
And so I think what this journey has taught me is to go, yeah, I'm going to think in that way because that's what my culture says.
Yeah.
But I'm not trying to learn my culture here. So if I just back up, and it doesn't matter, I'll just accept whatever is happening, and that's very freeing. And it's I don't think I consciously thought about that much until recently, but I have thought about it a lot recently because I'm starting to learn what is Pākehā and starting to think about what it is to be Pākehā, and it's different from being an English migrant.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And so that's and so now I'm spending a bit of reflective time when I walk and read and thinking, how do I respond as Pākehā?
Well, for me, there's an important role for Pākehā to play in what our future looks like. You know, when I say we, I mean Māori people. So I think we need to rely heavily on Pākehā and tauiwi, migrant communities. You know, we need the support from everyone, really. It's it would be great if we could do it alone, but I think, you know, bringing everyone along in the journey, making them part of it, making them understand what our culture is, though, and where there are lines that you can't cross. You know, that's important too. But I think collectively we need to move forward together.
I think so too. And, you know, an overused, we don't get, as Pākehā, to tell Māori how we do that.
Yeah, for sure.
And I know that Māori will often disagree on, I've heard people not liking it if Pākehā use frameworks that are made for Māori and by Māori for Māori. And so there's a lot of disagreement, and that will happen. We just have to work through those things. But
that aside, it's really and you know this. It's even difficult for Māori to agree with each other. So,
humans find that a problem.
Yeah,
I don't know why we would ever expect Māori to speak as one voice when no one else ever can. No. So why should they?
Yeah.
Unless you're some lot of super people that we haven't fully recognised.
Yeah. There's some things that we collectively agree on, but not a lot, you know, and only the things that affect us as a totality as well. But anyway, that's kind of heading in another political direction. Not really, but it's because it's one passionate to me. But we've gone way over time.
Let's stop.
But
we're ahead.
Yeah, no. So what I'd like to do is throw back to you for any last thoughts, anything you'd like to say in summary.
Nothing really. Here we all are. That's it. It's we just find ourselves in a place and a time together, and I like to look at the joy in that rather than too much else, even though you can hear me rant and rave quite a lot.
Fantastic. But, so, do you have a whakatauki you'd like to share?
I should have. He waka eke noa.
He waka eke noa. And what to you does that mean?
It means to me that we're all in it together, and the very best thing we can do is paddle in the same direction. And we might be able to put up with the odd person pulling the wrong way, but not everyone.
Kia ora. Tēnā koe, Alexa. Thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it. Whānau, if you enjoyed this video, like it, please subscribe. put any comments, any questions you've got, even for Alexa. We can get questions back to Alexa if we have to. So thank you so much. Thank you for being interviewed. And we'll see you on the next episode. Mā te wā.
Mā te wā.